We're going to go ahead and
all right, let's do a review before we go, because that's something we always begin with anyway. Now, there are a number of arguments that we use, a number of presentations or evidences that we are posing to people to demonstrate that the creation science model is indeed a credible scientific model. So we began with the first point, which is the origin of the universe. What is the second point?
Origin of life.
Origin of life, and then the third one will be? That's right. And the evidences for and the questions for the origin of the universe are different than for the origin of life, which is different than those used for the origin of species. What are the evidences used for the supernatural origin of the universe?
laws of thermodynamics.
Laws of thermodynamics. And there's 4 laws of thermodynamics. We only need 2. Thermodynamics 1 and thermodynamics 2. So we're using these 2 because number 1 says energy cannot be created nor destroyed by natural means. We're talking about creation, so we're looking at energy cannot be created or cannot create itself by natural means. And I explained, I like to add natural means because you'll get some smart aleck philosophers. Somebody says, well, if the first law of thermodynamics says energy cannot be created, then God can't create energy. But of course, that's just a smart aleck reply, and so you need to be prepared for that. And so I tag on there that cannot be created by natural means, and that just reminds us and sets us up for a little buffer there, a protection, to emphasize that this is a natural law derived from the natural experience and natural observations of the natural world. And as a result, it applies only to that which is natural, not supernatural. Now, the comeback will be, well, energy has always been here. Okay? If energy's always been here, didn't have to be created, now you have to be ready for the next response, which is what? Second law of thermodynamics. And that says that energy cannot organize itself into greater complexity by natural means. And again, we tag on there by natural means. God can organize it. But we recognize that if energy cannot organize itself in a closed system, and we describe the universe as a closed system, then how is it that the universe is winding down and going through a process called heat death? How is it possible that the universe wound itself up in the first place so it can be unwinding and experiencing this direction towards heat death? How is that possible? Well, it can't happen naturally according to the second law of thermodynamics. So we have to conclude then that, well, it must have been wound up supernaturally. And so with those 2 laws, we can build the case for a supernatural origin of the universe. That is such a beautiful approach there. It's simple. There's only 2 laws of science you need. And the nice thing about this is it is the laws of science. Now, they're not proofs, but laws of science are the closest thing science can provide. The closest thing to proof that it can provide. And so laws, so you might get a Dr. Harder up there in the audience when you're speaking. They say, well, laws are meant to be broken. What do you say then?
In the future.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. You can spend all the money and time you want to try to break a law. That's not unscientific. But the explanations that we offer today must conform to the laws we know today, and not what we hope to find tomorrow. Okay, that's a big deal there. All right, now we move on. Now that's all you have to know. I mean, you've got the argument hands down in favor of the creation science model with the law of thermodynamics. Now we move on into the law of biogenesis. The law of biogenesis is an argument for what? point?
Life.
Life, that's right. We're not talking about origin of the universe anymore. So when we talk about the origin of, or the law of biogenesis, we're talking about life from lifeless molecules. The first life form. I might explain that one of the reasons why this is not going to come up in conversation typically among creationists is because creationists are going to look at the whole picture, origin, universe, life, and speciation. But by breaking this down, you're able to communicate to the evolutionist who isn't thinking like a creationist. And you see, they have 3 different starting points, don't they? And one of the starting points is the origin of life. And so, what we do is we offer the origin, or the law of biogenesis. And that law says what? Thank you very much. Was that me or was that the battery?
We switched out bags.
Okay, great. All right, so the law of biogenesis says what?
Life can't come from anything dead.
That's right. All living cells must come from pre-existing living cells. Well, if all living things come from pre-existing living cells, where did the first cell come from then?
The ocean.
Yeah, right.
That's what somebody told me that.
Yeah. Okay, good. Now, so we answer back, we say, but what does the law of biogenesis say? The law of biogenesis says that living cells must come from pre-existing cells. If a person says, well, it comes from the ocean, then the response is, well, what living cells existed in the ocean at that time?
That's what my response was.
Oh, great. And what was their response? Here, hey, we got a live report from Alaska. All right, so what was their response?
Don't look at me like that one. They really didn't know, but they also brought...
They didn't know, okay, number one, but they have a response anyway.
And they also brought the sun into it as well. Because
all right.
the sun's spooting out all this stuff all the time.
Oh, what is the stuff?
Heat, energy.
Energy.
And that's why I said, well, where did the energy come from for the sun?
Okay, now here's what just happened. And this is a very important thing to keep in mind when you're debating any kind of debate, but on this subject in particular. Don't let it slide. It's like talking to a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon. You show them a verse, well, Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for by grace are you saved through faith, not of yourselves, gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Yeah, but look at this verse over here. Before you know it, you're jumping around all over the place. Say, now wait, tell me what this verse means here before we move on. Now, we start talking about the law of biogenesis. Where does the first life come? It comes from the ocean. And then they start getting into the sun, and now you just introduced energy, which means you're going back to what?
Universe.
The universe. But where did you start?
Life.
You see, you need to keep these 3 in check, and you're going to debate one or the other, but you can't debate both at the same time because there's confusion. And you got one set of arguments. Now, here's why they're going to jump around them. They're going to jump around because you locked them in. The law of biogenesis says life cannot originate out of lifeless molecules from the ocean or whatever. It doesn't matter how much energy is pouring out of the sun on the earth. Well, how is it possible that the lifeless molecules could organize themselves, even with sunshine on it, and form a living cell? Why, we could pour gasoline on lifeless molecules. That's energy too. We could shine a flashlight. We could boil it with a flame of fire underneath. I mean, what does that have to do with anything? So what? You've got energy pouring out of it. We can all sit here and guzzle down gasoline. Are you going to run better?
No.
It's energy. It's energy.
Well, it depends on if it's like this.
We could jump into a fireplace. That's full of energy too. Are we going to run better? No.
Yeah, we'd probably be running real fast.
Well, here's the point. Energy is not the answer. It's not the correct answer. It is an answer. That's what I mean by, they don't know, but they're going to have something to say anyway. You see, it's not, the question isn't whether or not there is energy or not energy. What kind of energy? You have to have usable energy that will make a difference. But even if there is energy in the system, and Dr. Jack Szostak over at Harvard is putting enough energy into the system there, trying to produce life in the laboratory, having an energy source, even adequate, that's not destroying, is still not producing life in the laboratory. It's not producing life. Why? Because those molecules are not capable of organizing themselves into a living cell. Why? Law of biogenesis says that all living organisms come from pre-existing living organisms. Now, prove that wrong. Well, it came from the ocean. That's where the first life came from. Well, what was in the ocean that made it possible?
That's right.
Well, the sun was beating down on the ocean. Well, the sun's beating down on the oceans now. And we don't see life popping up all over the place. I mean, so what is it about the oceans that gave rise to life? It's hard to predict what you're going to hear. They're going to have an answer. But remember, the law of biogenesis is in place because there is no plausible explanation. As we saw last night, if there were, somebody could go and claim their $1 million. So, did you use that one, Life Foundation?
My final answer was go to the website and listen to all the video.
Okay. Well, it would be good for them to go check out the Original Life Foundation and claim their $1 million if they think they got an explanation. But you know they don't. Okay, so this makes the point. Now, once they slip into the origin of the universe, what did you say then? With the sun and energy. Now we're into energy.
Because I said, well, where did the energy come from? From the sun.
Good. Okay, so now we're going to deal with the origin of the universe as opposed to origin of life.
And no answer.
No, okay.
It was there.
I tell you, you got it hands down.
There.
Yeah, you've got the science on your side. There is no way to debate against the laws of science. As Richard Dawkins up here, I showed you his quote. Nobody knows how, but somehow it did happen anyway without violating the laws of science. But we just don't know how. There is no explanation. All right, that brings us up to then. Oh, and then probabilities. We did deal with the law of probabilities. And the law of probabilities, the one that you will really want to remember is Dr. Horowitz's calculation. A theoretical cell having 124 proteins, which is purely theoretical, but he said that is the simplest number of protein molecules that could exist in a cell that is alive. It gave him a number to start out with. And he said, based on that, the probability that those molecules would organize themselves in a living cell is what? What's that number?
10 to the 134,000.
Yeah. Okay.
Million.
It's impossible.
10 to the 340 million.
Okay, 10 to the 340th millionth power. Now, what is the mathematical calculation of impossibility according to Ernst Burrell? 10 to the 50th. 10 to the 50th power is when you reach the mathematical threshold of impossibility. And Harold Morowitz, an evolutionist, calculated that the probability of a cell arising out of lifeless molecules would be 10 to the 340th millionth power. We're not even close. I mean, that probability left has such a distance between it and the number of possibilities. We're no longer talking about probabilities and possibilities. We're talking about the absurdly impossible. It's not going to happen. And it is the reason why the law of biogenesis stands today. It has not been undone. However, having said that, you may not learn. How many have been taught the law of biogenesis? Okay, just one or two of you. Okay, you heard the law of biogenesis? Well, what you might remember. You might have heard it, but you weren't paying attention in class at the time, right? Okay, now, here we've got just a few people. The law of biogenesis is purposefully being censored. And I gave you the story there at the University of Arkansas. After the lecture I gave, and I pointed out to Dr. Kramer that she was sitting on the committee that approved the book that I was quoting from, The Law of Biogenesis. That book disappeared, has never been, that book had been used for over 30 years, taught in freshman biology class. It ceased to be used as of that semester after that lecture, and then it was removed from the shelves at the library.
Wow.
Wow. That's how it's disappearing. So that's just like the rewriting of history, the rewriting of science, not because it's been shown to be wrong, but because it doesn't conform to the evolutionist claim that life originated from lifeless molecules.
And the Earth's flat.
Yeah, and the Earth's flat, that's right. And they'll you know, you might censor information about it being round. Now, one other thing I'll point out about this, the controversy, the debate, the evolutionists in their approach in censoring information, they do one other thing, and that is they control the information. And so they're redefining words. The other night I went through this. I think it was Monday night. I was showing you the definitions of words. They're redefining evolution to mean only descent with modification, speciation. Why? Because they get nailed on the origin of the universe, origin of life. They're contradicting laws of science. They cannot win the debate in that arena, so they say that evolution has nothing to do with that. Can you believe that? Has anyone ever heard that evolution has nothing to do with Big Bang and nothing to do with life originating from the primordial oceans? But your friend would only use the oceans because she's heard that. That's what we have been taught. That is not what the movement is teaching now. And I say a movement because Eugenie Scott, the National Center of Education, and other groups are now redefining evolution to remove its association with the Big Bang, the origin of the universe, and origin of life. So when they say evolution is a fact, now they're going to be talking about speciation. That's what we're going to get into tonight, and I'll show you why they say that. All right. Now, one other thing before we move on. You see, this is how science works. You build from an original point. We have established the empirical basis for origin of the universe. Is a good creation science explanation, is a good credible scientific explanation. Origin of life, we've established that because there is a case for the supernatural origin of the universe, supernatural origin of life, then it follows that, all right, there may be a supernatural origin of species as well. So we're building our case and we got momentum, don't we? That's arguing forward. Now, here's what we're going to look at. Laboratory results, fossil record, and the law of probabilities. Those are the only three things you need. Now, last night, some people are looking forward to talking about some other things like dinosaurs. We'll talk about that afterwards, probably in the Q&A. But see, dinosaurs, they fit in here. Dinosaurs are claimed by the evolutionists. That is the group of organisms that really catch the imagination. Of course, then they're talking about how long ago they were roaming the earth and all that the dinosaurs represent. But the only reason why they're associated with evolution is because that is the image and picture that has been used to stick the message of evolution to. But that's all it is. It's just a message that's been stuck to it. Actually, the dinosaurs, I guess I'm giving the answer now anyway, rather than waiting for Q&A. The dinosaurs are one of the best evidences for creation. Because here you have these huge organisms that are very unusual, plates up and down their backs and spikes on their tails and on their heads and all kinds of things that are associated with the images of dinosaurs. Now you would expect if there is any really choice organism that would at least have some precursors, some transitions, some evidence in the fossil record leading up to this monstrous size of dinosaurs and all these unique features. Dinosaurs are your best organism that you might select and say, okay, these things are going to have a trail in the fossil record. Guess what? Zippo. They just pop into existence and then they pop out of existence. And that is, they just suddenly appear and then they disappear. And the evolutionists have their explanations, but what is an explanation for the absence of the fossil record showing how they came to be? It's an excuse for the absence of evidence. These things don't have a trail leading up to them. Where is the trail that leads up to your Allosaurus? Or your Triceratops? Or your Stegosaurus? Where is the trail that leads up to these? They just pop into existence.
What happened to the alligators or crocodiles? Because they went through that transition and stayed with us.
Okay, now the alligators are thought to be, now in some evolutionary circles and explanations they say, well, the alligators are a throwback to primitive times and probably a representative of some dinosaurs. Now that's not true with all evolutionists because crocodiles and alligators really don't fit the picture of dinosaurs. What they're saying is that these are organisms that come from that time period relatively unchanged. That is just an explanation, all right? This is what we were talking about last night when someone asked another question. I forget what that question was right off. Oh, tailbones. Yeah, why do humans have tailbones? Well, tailbones, why do we call it a tailbone? Because evolutionary theory says that that's a tailbone, and that's associated with the tailbones of animals. But if you were to remove the tailbone off of a human, or cut the muscles that are attached, man, you would not be functioning properly. Why do we it a tailbone? Because of the evolutionary theory. You see, there are other functions for our tailbone. We need that bone structure there in our pelvis and the muscles that attach to it just to walk correctly. So we know that. So those images come to mind, what that might look like if you didn't have that. So what we know is that, and as I pointed out last night, is we know that there's going to be explanations for everything. But if you follow these through in the evolutionary tale of why there's a tail, why there's vestigial organs, that is throwback organs, it's all because they are put in the context of an evolutionary model rather than a design model. All right? They're just explanations. Why does the frog here in Alaska, why is that a particular frog, why is it hopping around, you know, in the summer and then through the winter, it just goes into an estuarization and it slows down its metabolism and goes into a freeze cycle. And then it thaws out. I was watching National Geographic years ago describing, well, the frog had to adapt to the colder climates of the frozen area, and so it had to develop this adaptation to survive. The frog doesn't have a brain. He wasn't thinking, let's see what temperature, oh yeah, it's going to freeze. I better start producing the proteins that will resist freezing. See, that's ridiculous. Now, evolutionists who are involved in this, they know that. But journalism, National Geographic and Nova Series, this is journalism, and they're making you, they describe it like the animals know what needs to happen, and so they start evolving so that they can adapt. This is not what evolution even teaches. But if it were, it is so fraught with circular reasoning that it makes absolutely no sense. It's just an explanation. Okay? So anyway, that's the same category as dinosaurs. The creationists can claim dinosaurs. And same way with tailbones, vestigial organs of any sort. So what I'm showing you here is the evidence that is going to establish the case for the creation science model, rather than just get into, you know, talking about explanations. All right, origin of species. Let's talk about that and define what a species is, because this is a problem. And I mean literally a problem. It's called the speciation problem. The speciation problem is that there is no standard for defining what a species is. If you talk to the ornithologist who specializes in birds, they're going to see new species pop up every time a new feather color pops out of some bird's head. Ah, new species. Whereas on the East Coast, you've got Ronopippians that has migrated from Florida up to Maine, established 5 separate colonies of, leopard frogs there, and established 5 separate colonies, and each colony can reproduce with the other previous colony. But the colony up in Maine cannot produce with the frogs down in Florida, because there's been enough behavioral change that's taken place between that population that they won't reproduce. Ah, but they're still the same species. Now wait, how can you have such change take place where they're not even going to reproduce here among 2 frog populations? They're the same species, but with the bird, a new feather color in the head, and it's a different species. That's the species problem. There's no standardized definition. So each group of biologists in their own field of specialty can define what a new species is at will. And that's a species problem. And here's why it's important for us as creationists to know that. When we say that no new species has appeared, and the evolutionist says, oh yeah, we see new species all the time. What are we talking about the same thing? No, you see. That is a problem. So we have to understand our words. Carolus Linnaeus is the father of taxonomy. He came up with this idea of species. The word species comes from the Latin word which means kind. Kind produces kind. Took it right out of Genesis chapter 1. So that's how it was originally defined. It has changed now, and that's not necessarily what it means. When we look at species, we're looking at arbitrary categories. And so rather than the same species here of organisms that can reproduce, we're looking at organisms that can reproduce, but they're categorized as different species. And so you get statements like this. It's clear that species concepts vary radically depending on their purpose. And naturalists have had a terrible time trying to reach a consensus on this point. It is the species problem. All right? So that just gives you a heads up. When you're talking about speciation, you're in muddy water here. And so you need to know that, especially when you're communicating to an evolutionist, what they mean and what you mean. And then you can at least try and explain it so you have common ground. So what the creationists are doing, they use the word kind. Right out of the English there, in the Bible, genetically unrelated kinds or types of organisms. Or sometimes they'll use the Hebrew word from baramin, genetically unrelated kinds or types of organisms. Sometimes they'll just say a type, like an it's an archetype that is sometimes used.
So in the creation model, what would be the purpose in, I'll use salmon for an example. Salmon species, and there's different genotypes within the species.
Yes. Genotypes. Okay, he's got a little more
That
background.
can all reproduce, but the offspring are all sterile. So in the creation model, what purpose is that?
Now, as far as purpose, we're not dealing with purpose. In the creation model, what will be said is, we know that these organisms have been created as a kind, and that from an archetype, these different modifications have taken place. Now, that's not purpose then. What we see is variation that has taken place, and here's the result by design. And what I mean by design is, there are the physical properties of molecules give rise to what behavior or what features are manifested in organisms. And that is by design because those molecules were designed by God with certain properties that make the behavior or the outcome of their reactivity predictable. So after a certain amount of modification, a certain amount of adaptation that may take place, and who knows, mutations that take place in the molecule as well, in the DNA molecule, you're going to result in, I won't use the word defective, but changes that are sufficient or are enough where the organisms can no longer reproduce. There may have been maybe a flip-flop of, and I'm not familiar with the salmon problem there, but it could be because there has been a flip-flop, a chromosomal mutation, flip-flopping some chromosomes, and that's where you've got pieces of chromosomes swapping from one set of chromosomes to another. That's a possibility, which means then you're doubling up or you're lacking some genes in the next generation. I'm not familiar with salmons or why that is a problem. But I'm just giving you an illustration that the creation science framework explains that we can explain many things based on the natural properties of molecules and laws as God has designed it. But we also recognize that their origin must have been supernatural. So here's what the creationists are doing. They're trying to define these boundaries of kind. Notice I didn't say the word species. They're trying to define the boundaries of what is a kind and where is that boundary where reproduction is limited. And so this is why the creation, there's nothing that the evolutionist is doing that a creationist can't do. Just dealing with it within a different model. All right, creation design involves identifying then these boundaries of reproduction. Now, that is along the top line there, we see that, okay, there are organisms that can produce other organisms like themselves. These are kinds. But you don't see a vertical connection there, all right? It's horizontal, isn't it?
Pretty funny organism.
Yeah, funny organism. Especially the spider, right? Now, let me tell you how organization works. This is called systematics or taxonomy. And this is going to be a real important point. Organizing organisms or items like cars or trucks or nails or whatever it might be, organization shows what the scientist is capable of doing. It doesn't show necessarily what has progressed or the relationship that exists between the items that have been organized. So here we have an example where we've got trucks on the top row, we've got some cars on in the middle row, some more antiques on the bottom row. Now we recognize, hey, they've been organized. Is there a biological relationship there? No. What that does is show that there is the ability of the observer, the ability of the scientist to organize them according to similarities and differences. That reflects upon the scientist, not the item. All right? And here's why this is important. When we start categorizing organisms in the world, we're looking at millions and millions of organisms. It's a big project, a big job to tackle. And so the creationists are really plugging along. Well, the evolutionists are too. I mean, there's a lot of organisms here trying to classify and organize and make sense out of them. So I don't expect to see anything come about in my lifetime or when the Lord comes back anytime soon. I don't see this being solved. There's a lot of work to be done, so I'm just showing you how that works. Now, organisms are organized into 7 categories. That's how we identify these things. Start out with your kingdom, and then your phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and you got this organization, and it narrows down to that species, which is your narrowest categorization. You start out with your biggest, which is your kingdoms. Currently 5 kingdoms. And so here's how this works. This is called conscription. And you've got different organisms that we see in nature, and we can start identifying their kingdom. So if we look at a particular kingdom, we've got 5 kingdoms here to work with, and we're identifying animalia, then we know we don't have plants or moner or fungi or protista up here. They're just animals. And then we go down to phylum and we add chordata. That means they've got a backbone here. So we eliminate all the invertebrates. And so now we narrowed it down. We come down to class and we get into mammalia. Now we've eliminated out the reptiles and the amphibians and the aves, the birds, and then we have primate. So we're down to the human and the monkey, and now we're down to hominidae, which as a family. So we've got the human here, and then we've got genus species, which is Homo sapien. That's how this order of classification works. Why is that important? That's so you can talk about the organism. So when you say Homo sapiens, you know what you're talking about. You're not talking about Canis familiaris or Campylobacter jejuni or something like that. You know you are specifically talking about a particular organism. That's called the scientific name, genus species. All right. So what we have here is just a means of organizing the organisms. Now, going back to the cars. Organization patterns do not show biological relationship, do they? It's just a way of organizing this mass of information or all these organisms. Now, here's what happens in the phylogenetic tree or the evolutionists. Here's what they do with the information. What is not obvious, what's not obvious in terms of the connection, they draw lines for you. Now, what happens when you look at the lines? Oh, I see what they mean. I see the connection now. The lines, the artistic expression, as much as a line can give you. It is the line that fills in the gaps that are missing connective points. It's the line. Let me show you how that looks. Now, are these organisms designed or did they evolve? Well, the evolutionists draw the lines so that you can see what may not be so obvious. And by connecting the dots, now it fills in the gaps in your mind and you say, oh, I see. What do you see? You see organization, but what is implied is biological relationship, and the line is what's connecting it. It's a powerful psychological effect on your thinking. There is no evidence to link them together but the line. Mm-hmm. You see how powerful that is? Just draw some lines. That's why I'm telling you that here, even Dr. Weiss in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Evolutionists, he said it's time to question our underlying assumptions. What is the assumption? The assumption is if there is a progression of similarity of organisms, they are biologically related. Really? How do you know that? You haven't demonstrated. All you did was demonstrate I can organize these things according to pattern. We can do that with nails. We can do that with cars. I brought that up at the University of Minnesota last week, and a young lady said, well, that's a straw man argument. Now, straw man argument is I present a false argument here and then I knock it down. But I said, this is not a straw man argument. This is a perfect illustration of what's going on. I'm illustrating with the cars what is happening with the animals. Now, the reason why that's not a straw man argument, it's a great illustration of what's going on with animals, is because with the cars, we know they're not biologically related. But the same thing, they can be organized just like we're organizing animals. So what's missing? The only difference is animals can reproduce. But have we demonstrated, because they can reproduce, does that mean they have reproduced through that succession? We still have not proven that point. All we did was organize. You see what that is? You see what's going on here? So that's why this is an underlying assumption. If we can organize and show the implied progression, therefore they have. No, they haven't. It's implied. And so all you have are the lines. Now, here's the meaning of similarity. And something that one scientist, one evolutionist came up with, he said if homologous features indicate genetic relationship, Your eyes are controlled by eye genes. Your hair controlled by hair genes. Your fingers and so on, all by genes. There are genes that control your various features. If there are genes if there's features, arms, limbs, and so on, are homologous from one type of organism to another, then you would expect that the same genes would be controlling the homologous limbs. But that is not always the case. And that really throws a monkey wrench into the works. Why? Because you would expect 100% of the time that if you have homologous features, homologous limbs, they ought to be controlled by the same genes if those genes have evolved to produce a homologous limb in another kind of organism. But that's not always the case. So there's an assumption that needs to be revisited. Michael Denton wrote, "The evolutionary basis of homology is perhaps even more severely damaged by the discovery that apparently homologous structures are specified by quite different genes in different species." But wait, if they're the same, homo means the same, homologous structures of two different organisms, why are they controlled by two different genes? The evolutionist has an answer to that. But again, an answer without the evidence. An answer or an explanation is not evidence. All right, what mechanism can it be that results in the production of the same patterns in spite of them not being controlled by the same genes? You see, you are what you are, and as all animals are, and plants, only because you're genes. Let me illustrate how this works. We are, and Paul refers to this in the book of Romans chapter 5, we are Adam. And we're more Adam than most people realize. You see, when God created Adam, He created Adam with a blueprint, information molecule, the chromosomes, the genes, the DNA molecule. And then He made Eve. But He didn't create Eve separately. He took a part of Adam and fashioned woman. That was the female version of the male version of Adam. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 2, it says, "And He called their name Adam." They are Adam. Why? Because she is Adam. She's just the female part of Adam, so they could produce more atoms. What's going on when you're producing more atoms? Well, you're just taking the DNA molecule and splitting that molecule and passing that code on in a single cell, and it starts growing into a new atom. So ultimately, what's going on in reproduction of any kind of living organism is just passing on that programmed information molecule, from which pops up a blip. This is what's going on. This is what's going on in life and in Adam. We are dittos. We are carbon copies. We have an information molecule that's been passed on to us, and a body pops up. And then that information molecule is passed on, and a new body pops up. In biology class, I call it blips, and I just draw the DNA molecule. It's all about the DNA molecule being passed on with these little blips. But it's all about the DNA molecule. You are Adam. Why? Your DNA molecule is a copy of the original that God gave to Adam. Another interesting thing about that is the way the DNA, and I saw you, so I'll get your question. The DNA molecule, when it's copied, isn't copied as a complete molecule like this into another complete molecule. It splits. And so half that molecule strand is a part of the next person, and that one is part of the next person. You know what that means? Theoretically, Adam's original DNA molecule could be floating around somewhere in the human population today. Now that's something, that's mind-blowing, isn't it? It could still be hanging around. Dakota?
Okay, so is it true that humans can adapt to their environment, right?
Well, all organisms have some degree of adaptability. I mean, you watch the Alaskans walking around here in swimsuits and t-shirts. I mean, there's no way I could possibly adapt to that. Okay, go on.
Couldn't that adaptation, like I'm not saying, like, couldn't it over time become even like more noticeable? Like,
oh, it definitely becomes more noticeable. You know, the dog picture I had up here? You got little Chihuahuas and big Great Danes and everything else in between. There's a lot of variation that takes place. Now, humans don't have that potential for variation apparently, and a lot of other organisms do not either. This is part of the work of the creationists, is to define where are these boundaries, and then to study what kind of variable potential is built into the DNA molecule according to its kind. All right. So from Adam, there was Eve, and just to back up a little bit on Eve, there was not new genetic material put into Eve. God left out the Y chromosome and doubled up on the X. So she is exactly what, she has the same material, the same program, information material that Adam had. So we literally are Adam copies. So right now there are about 7 billion atoms running around the earth. And that's why Paul could say in Romans chapter 5 that sin has passed upon all men, or I should say, for by one man sin entered into the world, and by sin death passed upon all men, for all have sinned. You don't die because Adam sinned. You die because you are Adam and you commit your own sins. And that's why he says later on, even though we don't commit the same sin after the similitude of Adam, we have our choice for sin. If you see one Adam sin, you're looking at yourself. You say, well, I would never do that. Well, you just have your own preference. See, we all have our preferred sins, but we're all choosing sin, right? I'll take it one step further, and I'll show you why you're so guilty of sin, regardless of what it is. And Paul even pointed this out in Romans chapter 2. After chapter 1, he lists all these, a whole list of sins, right? In Romans chapter 2, he says, Therefore thou art inexcusable, man, whosoever thou art that judgest, for wherein thou judgest, thou condemnest thyself, because thou hast committed the same things. Now, what you say, I've not committed all those sins listed in chapter 1. Well, yes, you have. It's built into you. You received it from Adam. Everything that one Adam can do, you can do. You may restrain yourself on some sins, but everything that you see one Adam do, you're carrying the same code. You're carrying the same potential there. All right? So, like, let's say for some of these high school massacres, which is really heinous, and we say, boy, that's just an all-out manslaughter going on. I would never do anything like that. But you have condoned that. I would never condone that. Well, you condone it because when you say, well, here, I can commit this sin. Well, what you're saying is, I can pick and choose my sin. Well, if you can pick and choose your sin, why can't they pick and choose their sin? So every time you pick and choose your sin, you're condoning all the other Adams to pick and choose their own sin. That's why you're guilty of every sin. Adam. There's no escape, Adam. No escape.
All right.
Briney?
Yes, sir.
On the DNA that you're talking about in that line, is there any evidence that DNA is breaking down?
All right. Well, let's see. I don't think I have a slide on.
I don't have anything to do with this, but
I'm just trying to remember if I put a slide in there. I did talk about the other night. It's called there's an ENCODE global project that's going on right now where they're collecting all the information of the DNA molecule, part of the human genome movement, and they are trying to make sense out of all that junk DNA. Okay, junk DNA. Is it deteriorating? Is it falling apart? Well, the fact is, what they're finding out, the 30,000 genes that were found and identified after the Human Genome Project, they said the rest was all junk. But as of last year, 2012, there was a publication put out, the research done by ENCODE, E-N-C-O-D-E, that demonstrates that all that junk DNA is actually not junk, but it's control switches to control those 30,000 other genes. And here's what's even more phenomenal. And they say it all happened by accident in evolution. Now, you've got 30,000 different genes, and each gene produces proteins. So you have protein segments. Well, these are protein segments that are going to be used and put together, let's see, like Lego blocks. And you put them together, and so you can get big Lego blocks, the same sorts of Lego blocks, red, blue, green, yellow, and so on. You can make all different sorts of things, from little robot men to dinosaurs or whatever you want to make. Your genes are being used the same way. With all these control switches, they're using all these 30,000 proteins, and it's the way they hook them together, and this one here, and this one here, and this one here, to produce just innumerable numbers of proteins with all different functions. So rather than have a gene for every specific protein that's needed, rather than all that redundancy, and what I mean by redundancy, let me see. Let me use an example of a text here. If I read laboratory experiments and observation, natural settings show that genetic change in populations is limited. If I run all those words together, you're going to see in the spelling that a lot of those have the same spelling sequence, right? Different words, different meanings, but they have the same sequence of letters. Your genes, your genetic makeup is so efficient that these switches take those segments where they have the same order of letters, and they say, okay, it's time to use it here. Okay, it's time to use it here. And through this repetition builds all this innumerable different types of proteins with the same sequence orders, just mixed and matched in different sequences. It's phenomenal.
It's mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling. How did that evolve? Yes, sir.
All right. If I'm understanding this correctly, I was thinking about bears, for instance. Up here we have black bears, grizzly bears, and polar bears. So both bears have the same DNA. It's just that different genes are selected for.
Different genes are being expressed. There may have even been some effects, some mutations that affect some of the genes. So it affects its size as well as color, as well as other types of features in the bear. And this is what creationists are trying to do, is to identify. And now we know, see, as of last year, we know that it's about these switches. So it's not just a matter of change or alteration that takes place in the 30,000, humans speaking, in the genes that actually code for the functional protein, but all the switches as well are going to be affected. So the combination of those switches and how the proteins are ordered, the original proteins from as products from the DNA molecule, what they're going to have to do, what the creationist has to do, is figure out where has all this alteration take place, this variation. Why do these variations take place? It may even give rise to the answer of why are some kinds of organisms more capable or have more potential for variation than others.
When you hear the term a genetic marker, like they're going to test you for a genetic marker that's a telltale of a disease, they're looking for a specific sequence. They're looking for an order in that sequence that sticks out.
And that is, and they'll do that both for a protein, which has a direct relationship to a gene, or they're looking for the genetic, for the gene code itself. It can go both ways. If I know the gene code, then I know what the protein order is going to look like with amino acids. If I know the protein, I can break that down and determine what the code is, the genetic code. I can go either way. That's probably more than you wanted to know, but it is phenomenal. The main thing I want to point out in answer to your question are as far as deterioration, that right now it's too premature to say that it's deteriorating. It's functional, and we're finding out all that junk DNA is not really junk DNA. They're control switches to make the few. You see, that was astounding. One of the things that amazed scientists was 30,000 genes, and here we are with all our complexity? How do you explain that? It's how you mix and match all the products of those genes.
That
Yes.
was a really interesting question. You know how like in the Bible it says people live to be just hundreds of years old, but yet, you know, with all of our modern medical wonder medicines and drugs and, you know, just things that, you know, it is helping people to live longer and finding cures for things and stuff, but it just kind of makes you wonder about the DNA of the person.
It will be DNA related, and that's something those are questions. And I like to take advantage of these sorts of questions to point out this is how research works. The design that has been put into the molecules, the properties of the molecules, can make predictions. Will it be possible to determine why lifespan has changed based on the DNA molecule? That's a question that has to be posed, and then figure out what do you look for to find the answer.
Yeah.
That's how these things are found. And it takes one little step at a time. Science takes a long time, but that's because you got to break it down. And speaking of lifespan, a report just came out a couple days ago. Women are their lifespan is starting to drop. Shorten. Yeah.
Why?
They're working too hard.
Yeah, yeah. It doesn't have an explanation. It is.
They're trying to get back the rib.
Oh, yeah.
No, they became equal.
Yeah, see, now the women are getting ribbed about it. All right. Yeah. Okay, let's deal with, now, what I just finished up here with on these slides was organization. I want to make sure we don't lose sight of that point. That organizing organisms is not evidence for biological relationship. What the evolutionists say is that's what we predicted. I say, okay, well, that's fine. So you predicted it, but that doesn't mean that you've given the evidence to connect the dots biologically now. All right? Because the creationists could make the same prediction. They didn't, that I know of. But they could have, and they have given explanation after the fact that you would expect with a creation that the designer would oftentimes use. I think Joe mentioned this last night. Yet you're going to see commonality of design from one organism to another depending on what the features are needed or the function is needed. So let's move on to the next question. Can organisms change? Well, of course they can. This is called mutation of the DNA molecule. And so I'm going to use two words, genotype and phenotype. The genotype refers to the genes, the code, the genetic code of the organism. Phenotype is the physical feature, what you actually look at. So genotype is going to produce the phenotype that you actually see. You don't see the genotype. Now, when there's a change in the genotype, it changes the phenotype. Sometimes, most of the time. Most of the time, mutations are going to end up lethal. So the cells are not going to survive. But the fact is that they do survive enough that we see plenty of variation. So it doesn't matter that most die after a cell mutates, because there's plenty of cells that still survive. 1 in a billion cells, what was estimated by Max Delbruck back in the 60s, got a Nobel Prize for his finding the answer. It's one of those big questions. How often does a cell mutate? And he discovered that, at least in prokaryotes, that 1 in 1 billion cells will survive mutation. Most of the others die. All right, now, progressing through this and understanding genotype-phenotype relationship, Lamarckian theory of genetics was keep cutting off the tails of mice and the next generation will have short tails. That means if I affect the phenotype, the genotype will be affected. We know that's not true. Now, there is epigenetics, where the environment is going to affect the gene expression, we can do that. We used to do that in the laboratory with bacteria, and we know that if we fed bacteria with a fructose sugar, that it would turn off the glucose gene, so its preference was use up the fructose, and then after the fructose was gone, the inhibition of the glucose gene would diminish, and then it could start metabolizing glucose. So it was just a control, a genetic control from the environment, and so part of that is what's called epigenetics. But this sort of thing is phenotype. We're talking about changing the phenotype, not the environmental influence, but the phenotype does not affect the genotype. Now, when there's a change in the DNA, in the chromosome, in the genetics, that's called a mutation, and it brings about some change in the phenotype. And there's a lot of mutations, most of them are harmful, but they do occur. And so you see all kinds of strange and remarkable things that are possible in nature, and this is because mutations, and they could be point mutations or they could be chromosomal mutations, all kinds of different types of mutations. But here's the point. In the creation science model, the issue is not whether or not change occurs. No, there's no debate there. The debate is how much change can occur within a defined population. This is why I mentioned the speciation problem is so important to understand. There's a speciation problem. Vocabulary is very important. We have to define, as creationists, it's important to define where these boundaries are and establish whether or not there are boundaries. But you see, within that given boundary, you can have any kind of change, Dakota. And that's what, so you can be building up all kinds of change, what is called a genetic load in the population, that can be expressed. And maybe some populations are going to show more potential for change than others. But that is what is that's what creationists need to work on, is define that kind, and that the changes that you see within that kind are going to have, so they're going to run up against this boundary. They're not going to go past the boundary of kind.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but when mutation occurs, it's never an addition to the information that the cellular level has. Isn't it always a subtraction of information?
That is the information theory. I'll tell you, that is exactly what William Dembski and others at the Discovery Institute are working on. They've got some new material. I haven't read through it completely. So to be honest with the information, they have, as far as I know, based on where my reading has stopped, the information is not added to, and that was the whole argument of Dembski, is that in the information theory that there is an entropy effect. So an entropy, remember, is a disorganization or a deterioration of information. So you're not increasing its complexity, but you're decreasing. The problem I've had with that, and I think the recent articles that I've seen Dembski coming out with, is addressing this, and I have to read them to be fully aware of. But the problem I have had with that theory is that organisms are open systems. Entropy applies to what?
Closed systems.
Closed systems. As long as you have the ability to input energy, then you have the ability to increase the organization of information or order or whatever it might be. And so as long as you're eating and fueling yourself, you're always able to sustain and work against the effect of entropy. Now, if you were in a closed system, yes, then you'd be trapped and you'd have a deterioration. So, to answer your question completely, I can't, but I will. I do have a couple articles on my desk at home that are ready to be read. And now that you asked me that question, I'm anxious to go home and finish reading. But the point is that the information theory, I've already had that problem with that particular approach, that you're not going to see an increase of information. because it's an open system. So why not? I mean, I think the evolutionists have a good rebuttal. Why not? It's an open system. It won't affect us though. All right, now natural selection. That was mutation. Now we're moving on to natural selection. These are the two major mechanisms for change that Darwin had originally proposed. There's others like gene flow and population genetic flows and so on. A lot of little models that study the change and the adaptation that occurs in populations. But mutation and natural selection are your two pillars in evolution. So that when an evolutionist says evolution is a fact, this is what they're referring to. Natural selection being like a frog adapting to colder weather, or birds adapting to warmer climates, reptiles and man, whatever. There's adaptability, there's variation that is selected for. In the Bible we see Jacob was selecting for streaked and spotted goats, and then Laban changed the wages, so then he said, okay, well fine, you can have the spotted ones, I'll take the non-spotted ones. And what he was doing, artificial selection in the breeding process, he was selecting out the genotypes that coded for spots. And so he bred spotted goats with spotted goats, and he got all the goats. And got Laban's goat as well in the process, which he didn't like, so he kept changing his wages on them, right? So when we're talking about natural selection, this is not a debate, not a point of debate. Again, the debate point between creationists and evolutionists is how much change can occur. Now, creationists are proposing that all the change that we observe is horizontal, and that's what we actually see within each kind. The evolutionists are proposing a vertical potential for change through the course of all the different types of organisms. And so here's the debate point: horizontal versus vertical, limited change versus unlimited change. This is what the debate is all about. It has nothing to do with mutation, nothing to do with natural selection. It's something that the straw man arguments that come out of the evolution camp against creationists is guilty of. They will set up, when there's mutations occurring, they say, see, evolution is a fact, it's happened. As though, hey, we just put a nail in the coffin of creation every time a mutation takes place. That's not the case. That's why when I was taking that evolution class with Dr. Carr, he said, I'm surprised you're so open-minded. I said, well, creationists don't have a problem with mutation. I mean, I used it in my own lab all the time, subjecting my bacteria to ultraviolet radiation, and we used it in our molecular cloning class. There's nothing about mutation or natural selection pressures that bothers or does not fit into the creation science model. All right, so just to repeat this, here's the debate question. Not whether change occurs, but how much change actually occurs. So the question then, how much? You know, this really helps evolutionists understand the real problem too. This is why when you see evidence paraded in your textbooks or published in journals and so on about all this change taking place, what you're seeing is the evidence of change and adaptability that takes place within a defined population. And creationists are very interested in that information. They want to know where these boundaries are. If there has been adaptability and variation actually take place, then we want to know that, because we know that the variation can go beyond this particular point. So that's a very legitimate part of our research. Now that we know what the real debate point is, now we can look for the evidence. We know what evidence to look for. And the evidence is there evidence for limited or unlimited genetic change? What does the evidence show? Well, with the fruit fly, it's very interesting, because here you have the classic evolutionary experiment for over 100 years. This poor little creature, Drosophila melanogaster is its name. Big name for a little guy, huh? That's the little gnat that flies around your fruit.
Who gave it the name?
That was Dostoevsky melanoga. No, I'm just making that up. But I don't know where that name came from. But it is the genus species name, melanogaster, referring to its color. But here we've got fruit flies of different sorts. 100 years, about 100 years of genetic mutations taking place. Now, what I mean by that is accelerated mutational events, where this little critter has been bombarded with all kinds of radiation to mess around with its genes and cause mutations. Accelerate the mutational process. They have a gestational time of 10 days, so every 10 days they're reproducing. And with this bombardment of radiation, you have an accelerated mutational system going on every 10 days, producing more flies. And by the way, PETA doesn't mind what you do to a fly. They have done all kinds of things to those little critters that you might say, well, it's just absolutely inhumane. But they have had no problem with that. So, and they can live in the most remarkable little inhumane containers too, every 10 days, and feed them.
Where does PETA draw the line on which organisms they get concerned about?
I don't know. I don't keep up with PETA. I'm just glad they weren't around when I was working with mice. Yeah, all the paperwork you have to do now. But anyway, on the fruit fly, now that we know what the question is, limited versus unlimited change, we can go to the laboratory and say, okay, what is the evidence for limited or unlimited change? What actually is supported? Well, here we see, I've got a couple quotes, the formation of a new species by any mechanism has never been observed. That is, these fruit flies have been mutated for over 100 years. Millions of fruit flies have been produced. They're still fruit flies. You see, it was the hope of the evolution, of the evolutionists, that this is the one organism. No other organism has been put through this sort of system. It was sort of the hope of the evolutionists that this organism would become something new and different. But it's not. It's still a fruit fly. Despite a close watch, we've witnessed no new species emerge in the wild in recorded history. Again, the problem with this quote is they're using the word species, and there's a speciation problem, right? What does the word species mean? He's referring to type, but the point is that no new kind of organism has popped up. That's what's being said.
So the gist of this, to sum it up, is no matter how you reorganize the Legos, they're still fruit fly Legos.
That's right, exactly. And they haven't become anything else. And so I'm just quoting different people here who are giving their evaluation, their disappointment. Boy, we were really holding out that we were going to produce. I mean, if any organism was going to do it, it would be this. Most remarkably, we've seen no new animal. That includes no new species of fruit flies in hundreds of millions of generations of fruit fly studies. I mean, there's still fruit flies. We also clearly see that the limits of variation appear to be narrowly bound and often bounded within species. So the point here is that the fruit fly is still the fruit fly, the dog is still the dog, the frog is still the frog, and so on, and it has the laboratory evidence. So what does that mean to us? The creation science model says that kind produces kind. God created each organism as a kind, and that change occurs, but it's always limited within the boundary of a defined kind. And what does the laboratory evidence suggest as of today?
True.
It's true. It's limited. That's right.
But you know, amongst dogs, there's quite a variety of different dogs.
Yes.
They're all dogs. But in the fruit fly, your pictures at least, they've been messed with even more than dogs.
Oh, yeah.
And there's not as many different varieties or looks to the fruit fly as there are in dogs.
Yeah, this is one of the things I was pointing out for Dakota and Joe as well over here, is that it appears, and this is an interesting study of genetics, it appears that from kind to kind, some kinds of organisms have a greater potential for change than others. And so that's an interesting study in itself, to define why is it, to identify which to define the amount of change that is associated with each type of organism. But then to go further and say what gives it the ability to change that much or not so much. So these questions have not been answered. They're still being studied. By the way, we've come a long ways in genetics because it was 1955 when the DNA molecule was even shown to be what it is. 1955. Isn't that amazing? So I was born in 1956. That's about how old I am. That's how long we have known about the DNA molecule. Prior to that, they thought it was protein that was the genetic code. And now we have 3 billion nucleotides knocked off. We know that 3 billion nucleotides make up the genetic code of the human DNA. And now we're starting to tinker with it and map out the blueprints and figure out what its products are. We've come a long ways in 50-some years.
What's the point?
Here's the biggest point.
Man's been trying to kill the mosquito and the no-see-em and the flies, for crying out loud, for all of this time I can remember. I was born in 1926, and they still haven't got rid of it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we're getting closer. I'll tell you, we're not necessarily closer. You know, there's been some articles out on the new superbugs for several years now. The superbugs being bacteria, being germs. And you probably have heard about the or the streptomycin-resistant strains bacteria. One of the most dangerous places now to be is in a hospital because that's where your nosocomial infections are. And so one of the reasons for that is because that's a perfect condition, a sterile condition where it's selecting, natural selection process going on for selecting these bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. And now we've got these bacteria floating around. I know 3 people personally who have died from this type of disease. And one guy, all he did was fall down on his bike and scratch his leg. I mean, who thinks about scratching your leg, you know? And the next day he's dead. Because this thing really moves fast and there's nothing you can do. You put you in the hospital, put you on an IV, drip you with all kinds of antibiotics, every kind that's known to man. But these things are untouchable right now. We're going back to the days of Fleming when he came up with penicillin. Before then, you get a staph infection, you're dead. And now we're coming back to those days. It's just like the Bible says in Matthew 24. The days of pestilence are going to be upon us. One of the signs of the end times. That's sort of interesting. We're coming into it. Dreadful to think about, but we are at that point where the diseases have adapted and protecting themselves from us. Having said that, there's a lot of nanotechnology and antibody cloning approaches trying to zero in with basically search, seek, and destroy type products now, where we can go in and knock out not only germs for our disease, but also cancer cells. So that's one of the benefits. The more you know, the more you have control over what's going on.
And
but
you can't develop an immunity to those kinds of things.
That we know of right now.
Yeah.
We didn't know about that before either. But you would think theoretically you should be able to always to shift your strategy, you know, and you basically use warfare tactics. In immunology, you start out learning about immunology. Your body is under constant attack 24/7 every moment of your life. Your body is in defense mode and fighting off infection. All right, this demonstrates the circular reasoning of natural selection. Well, the organism exists today because it's more fit. How do we know it's more fit? Because it exists. Why does it exist? Because it's more fit. How do we know it's more fit? Because it exists. And so this is the what is called a tautological argument. Natural selection is really unprovable. It's not falsifiable. And so evolution has that particular problem. All right, I'm going to advance through here. Limited change in the laboratory. If organisms do not naturally produce new species by natural means, then where did all the different species come from? We can go back to, in the fossil record, to the Cambrian explosion, what is called the Cambrian explosion by evolutionists, and all your basic archetypes or body plans are there. They just pop up, and there are no transitional forms or organisms leading up and showing where all these organisms came from. They just popped into it.
Stuff is alien looking.
What's that?
The Precambrian stuff is alien looking.
Well, and that's right. And part of the reason for that, I should say that not only are most of the body types that exist today already viewable or visible and observed in the Cambrian, but there's a whole lot more that existed than exists today too. There's a lot more organisms that are extinct today than are alive today. All right, so here's the conclusion we can draw from the laboratory, and that is the laboratory evidence supports the creation science model, which says that change is limited within a kind of organism. The empirical data from the laboratory supports the creation science model. Now, Rene Delbecco, he had made an interesting statement, saying the evolutionary events that took place over a period of many thousands of years cannot be reproduced in the laboratory. If that's the case, all right, what they're saying is we can't demonstrate this in the laboratory, that there's unlimited genetic potential. I don't have a problem with that. I think that's perfectly legitimate, but it's an excuse. It's not evidence. What they're saying is, here's why we can't give you the evidence. It's because it takes too long for it to actually happen. And so you can't expect millions of years worth of change to be represented in 100 years in the laboratory. Fine, no problem with that. But what have you just given me? An excuse for the absence of evidence. That's an explanation. Remember I was talking a little earlier? An evolutionist will have plenty of answers and explanations to give, but that is a sorry substitute for evidence. What does the evidence show in the laboratory right now? Change is limited. The claim that change is unlimited lacks laboratory evidence. All right. And then probability. This was calculated quite a while ago, but 1,000 to the millionth power. That's incredible. All right, that brings us to the fossil record. Now, we're running out of time as far as really covering this, but I'll just give you this particular bit of information. I'll advance here. I like this guy. I like this picture here. The gradual change of fossil species has never been part of the evidence for evolution. Yeah, how many here would ever think you'd ever hear that statement coming from an evolutionist? The fossils have nothing to do with evolution. We don't need that evidence. It was never important in the first place. Why do you suppose they're saying that? Because they don't have the fossil record necessary. Look at this. Prior to that time, prior to this time when Ridley had come up with that quote, I found it of all places in an airplane magazine. And Ridley was writing an article about the unimportance of fossils. In fact, I was going to a conference to speak on creation science. I said, man, I need that quote. Because you see, up until that time, Darwin and others were saying evolution requires and needs the fossil record. Ridley comes along and says, you know, it's never been important. Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. And so, let me leave you with a word here, a term. Punctuate equilibrium. Let's see. Punctuate equilibrium. In fact, you might find this interesting. When you, this is by Francis Hitching. When you look for the links between major groups of animals, there simply aren't there. See, they connect the dots, what's missing with the lines. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions or organic design has been a persistent nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. Notice the word gradualistic evolution. It doesn't work. We don't see it in the fossil record. So what we have is Punctuated equilibrium. I'll leave you with that term. Punctuated equilibrium is this. The fossil record actually shows what we see in nature today. That populations of organisms resist change. They don't want to change, they resist change. Darwinian evolution was organisms are in constant, ongoing change. That's not true. That's not what we see today. It's not what we see in the fossil record. We see resistance to change. And so while this population is resisting change, they're building up what is called a genetic load and changes and mutations in the population. Then when some catastrophic event of some sort takes place, a fire or a sudden cold or something happens, or a separation, there's different mechanisms for selection pressures. But organisms are separated from their population. They carry with them certain genes, and they may be carrying genes that are not a part. They're taking genes with them. The only supply of genes with them off to establish a new population, and the old population doesn't carry their genes. All right, part of the gene flow process, and I gave a founder example there. So what happens then is you have organisms going through a change. That is, that gene is starting to be manifested now. And so that new population that springs up starts looking different than the original population. All right, so here's what punctuated equilibrium is. That populations sustain themselves and exist over long periods of time at equilibrium. Punctuated by rapid change, establishing a new population at equilibrium. Punctuated by rapid change and then establishing a new population of equilibrium. This is this is the evolutionist explanation for why you see fully formed, fully functional organisms fully isolated from other populations. It's because that during equilibrium, fossilization is so rare. You see enough organisms that have existed, they've been fossilized, you see those organisms. But the organisms that have gone through rapid change in a punctuated period of time, rapid period of time means 1 to 2 million years as opposed to 1 or 2 million years. All right, we're talking about 1 to 2 million years. So that's evolutionary time, that's very rapid. So in a million years, you have rapid change. There were so few organisms that existed going through transition that there weren't enough to be actually recorded and trapped and fossilized so we could see them. So they're missing. But once they establish themselves, then there's millions and millions of representative forms in their new body type. We see those documented in the fossil record. And then those change in a punctuated period of time, so rapid, so few organisms aren't trapped, we don't see them, and then we see a new population of organisms. So in the fossil record, the reason why we see what we see and the missing links are missing is because they occur during these brief, rapid periods of time, punctuated. The creation model says that because God has created organisms, kind producing kind, that what you would see in the fossil record is fully functional, fully formed organisms, fully isolated from populations from one another. What does the fossil record show? Exactly that. And the evolutionists have an explanation for why it is that way in their model.
Wow.
But what is it? It's an excuse for the absence of evidence.
Yeah, it's creative thinking.
Creative thinking, that's right. Maybe they are creationists. So, unwittingly. So what we have here is an example of explanation being substituted for real evidence. What we have is laboratory evidence and fossil evidence on our side. Remember, all the fossils, all the transitions, all the progressions that are shown to you in your book and on TV and Nova series and so on, these are the changes that take place within a kind. So what? Big deal. We're interested in that. We want to know how far to what degree can these changes take place.
So that's not evolution.
That's not evolution. I won't give them the word. They'll say, some like to use the word microevolution, and some will say, oh, that's all evolution is. I won't give them the word. You know why? because they play with those words, they spin those words, and there's too much associated with the word evolution. I will say adaptation, variation, but I will not give them the word evolution.
What kind of excuse are they going to give when they end up in hell?
Oh!
There is no excuse.
I mean,
They're gonna hope they evolve to warmer weather tolerance.
There is no excuse.
I'm pretty sure Darwin's a creationist now.
Depends on how long it takes them to get there.
What?
Depends on how long it takes them to get to hell, and whether they can adapt in that amount of time.
proves to the Lord because they're going to sit there and burn for the rest of eternity.
Well, you know what we have here, evolution has been used to blind the hearts and minds of them lest they should see the light of the glorious gospel. And that is why 1 Peter is so important for us. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be prepared always to give an answer to every man that asks of the reason of hope that lies within you. So I love doing this series. I love passing it on. I've organized the information. My goal is to transmit to you something that is usable and effective in communicating to others the principle of creation science. And the way I approach it with a secularist is, I'm not attacking evolution. It'll take care of itself. I am presenting the credible case, scientific case for the creation science model. I needed that as an atheist. I needed to hear the information that was sufficient for me, so then Chuck could share the gospel with me. But you see, what was happening was, whether it's philosophy, or whether it be entertainment, or drugs, or whether it be science, there's always something that is being used by Satan to keep people blinded. And we need to fight that to be effective.
No, what you just said is what I was going to say.
Okay.
He's always got a counterfeit or something to...
That he is, angels of light, and it comes as scientific truth, but it's not. Now, there's more I'm going to point out tomorrow night, and Dr. Evolution is going to be here. You will have opportunity to debate.
The wind kicked up that we were expecting today.
Okay,
Wow.
finally came.
That's supposed to really get up to about 60 or 80
Okay.
tonight.
Well, anyway, tomorrow night, Dr. Evolution, he's got an advantage because there's a few more tricks up his sleeve.